We're gonna go over the review, right?
I'm sorry?
We're gonna go over the review, right?
We are, most definitely. But before we do, we've got work to do before we get to a review. Oh, sorry about that. Okay. Can everybody see this? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, good. So this is a review from where we were on Monday, which went through a series of definitions about different types of tariff. We talked about a fixed or specific tariff, then a tariff that is a percentage of the overall value, which is an ad valorem tariff. We pointed out with a specific tariff, the level of protection varies inversely with the price. The higher the price, the lower the protection, as opposed to an ad valorem tariff that, as the price increases, a percentage of the value. So if it's a tariff on a suite of Toyota cars, that means that there's a constant degree of protection based upon a percentage of the cost of each car as you go from the lower price models to the higher price models. We introduced the idea, of compound tariffs, which have those two components, the fixed component of the specific tariff and the ad valorem component, to protect what? To protect the manufacturer from raw material costs, from higher raw material costs that arise from what? Protection that's granted to raw material suppliers like cotton manufacturers, and also to the finished goods industry, right? So that for example, we talked about woven fabrics, and so therefore the manufacturer is compensated both for the higher cost of the cotton and for the competition she faces from low-cost woven fabric imports. As I'm going through this, any questions, jump in, please. We went through the different types of customs valuation that's used, the free on board valuation, which is common in the United States, which does not include logistics or transportation costs, as opposed to the cost insurance fate valuation method, which is what's used in Europe, that the dutiable good, the dutiable value is based upon the value of the good as it leaves its exported, its home country, and that includes all the transportation, logistics costs, insurance costs before the dutiable value is assessed. Then we introduced the idea of nominal versus effective rates of protection, and we said what? The effective rates of protection take into consideration any tariffs on the inputs in the overall product. We said that if the tariff on the imported input is less than the tariff, the nominal tariff, then the overall effective rate is going to be greater than the nominal tariff. In the case of an inverted tariff, where the tariff on the input is greater than the tariff on the finished good, then we know that the effective rate is going to be what? It's going to be less than the nominal rate. In that same vein, we then talked about, well, with regard to inverted tariffs, and one of the things that the U.S. has done to address or correct that imbalance is through foreign trade zones, where importers can bring in various component parts and they can assemble the component parts into a finished good, all within a foreign trade zone, to undo the disadvantage of inverted tariffs, presuming that the imported inputs, we used the example of a lawnmower the other day. With the lawnmower, the mower itself had a tariff of 5% or duty of 5%, as opposed to the lawnmower, which had a 0% tariff. So you might as well import the, excuse me, just one second, hold on, just a second. Airbag? I can't use the headphones. Okay. I can't use the headphones. Okay. Okay. Pardon me, people. Pardon me. I'm back. Can you hear me, everybody?
Yes.
Yes.
Can I get a yes?
Yes.
Yes,
Yes.
yes.
Okay, good. Thank you. Fantastic. I had to take those earphones out. Thank you very much. Okay, so again, we talked about inverted tariffs and the concept of delaying duties, which is made available by bonded warehouses and foreign trade zones. What's the difference between the two, really? The difference is what you can do in each, right? Because what can you do in a foreign trade zone? Just about everything. But you can't do that in a bonded warehouse. But you can, you can do very limited things. You can't manufacture. You can't do any type of processing, high-tech processing in a bonded warehouse. You can do basic assembly and packaging, but you can't do any manufacturing, which you can do, of course, in a foreign trade zone that makes the type of solution to inverted tariffs we talked about possible. Okay, so this is our review from Monday. Then we introduced the idea, we started talking about the idea of welfare effects and tariffs. And we identified the consumer surplus and producer surplus. And then we moved on to the welfare effects that we can identify as a result of trade, the result of tariffs or trade under tariffs. We see here a nation at autarky that's selling, that's producing 50 cars and selling it $9,500 a unit. We can identify the producer surplus and the consumer surplus of the nation in autarky, the area above the supply curve and the below the price for producer surplus and below the demand curve and above the price for consumer surplus. Moving on, we said that once the country begins to trade with the rest of the world, we say it's a small nation, therefore it's a price taker. It's going to get the price on cars, whatever the world price is. So it faces a constant world price. And in this case, the constant world price is $8,000. So before it was at $9,500, now at $8,000. Well, everything above $8,000 is consumer surplus, right? So that's fantastic for consumers. They're paying, instead of $9,500, $8,000 a unit. Well, excuse me, domestic producers ask for what? They want protection. So they get $1,000 a unit tariff. The full cost of the tariff is absorbed by the consumers because the exporters from other countries are not concerned about the demand from this small nation. This small nation has no ability to influence the price. They're a price taker. And so therefore, anything above the new price, everything below the new price and above the old price from 8,000 to 9,000 represents a loss in consumer surplus to the domestic consumers. We see here a transfer. We see here the various welfare effects. First, there's the transfer of consumer surplus to producer surplus as a result of the tariff. Then, as a result of increased protection, increased production under the tariff, increased, we say, inefficient production because it's more costly production displacing lower cost production. We see an increase in domestic production from 20 to 40 units. That represents the protective effect. The consumption effect is represented by D on this slide, which suggests, which identifies lower consumption. The consumption went from 80 to 60. Why? Because of the higher price. And C represents the revenue effect, which is the government's collection of the tariff. Okay. Are there any questions on this? Okay, good. So now we're going to take a look at some new material then. Okay. We're talking about tariffs and the idea and tariffs in the large nation, right? Tariffs in a large nation. Well, the difference in a large nation is that in a large nation, exporters into a large nation have an incentive to do what? If the U.S. imposes a tariff, Japanese exporters have an incentive to do what on the tariffs that the U.S. imposes? Pardon me?
Absorb the tariff?
They have an incentive to absorb the tariff. And if not absorb the tariff, perhaps split the increase in cost between the tariff, between themselves and the consumer, right? So that the large nation like the US, the EU, or Japan are not price takers, they're price makers. And so the tariff effect can be shared between domestic consumers that might pay slightly higher prices and foreign producers that are going to be realizing a lower price than under free trade. Okay, so let's take a look here And we see here that at autarky, the nation is producing and selling 70 cars at $9,600 a unit. Okay. Next, we see that under free trade, the equilibrium price at free trade is $8,000 a unit. At free trade, the nation, which is a large nation, is going to produce 30 cars instead of 70, but it's going to consume 110 cars, which represents what? It represents imports of 80 cars. So domestic consumption is increasing, domestic production is falling, and imports are increasing. Okay? So the nation went from $9,600 a unit at autarky to $8,000 a unit once trade begins. Now we see here that as a result of the tariff, the supply curve increases, and we have the new equilibrium supply price of $8,800 a unit. So we see what? We see that with the new price, the new tariff-induced price, we see that overall demand falls from 110 to 90 units. Overall domestic production increases from 30 to 50 units, and overall imports shrink from 80 to 40 units. Okay, as a result of the increase in prices. Now, what is an increase by the whole amount? Why didn't it go from 8,000 to 9,000? What do you think? In other words, the price was 8,000 free trade.
I think it was 10%. So that's why it went 8.8 instead of 9,000.
Okay, well, let's take a look. Let's take a look first at our welfare effects. We see the consumer surplus has fallen by the area A, B, C, D, because the price went from 8,000 to 8,800. We know that we have the transfer of consumer to producer surplus, the protective and consumption effects, and of course the revenue effect. Then we have the protected market price, which exceeds the foreign supply price by the amount of the duty, but doesn't exceed the free foreign trade supply price of 8,000 by that amount because some of the tariff has been absorbed by the producer. That's the increase in national welfare. So we have our redistributive effect here, which we've added up. It's $32,000, which represents a gain of income. We have the deadweight losses, which is your inefficient use of resources, your protective effect, plus your consumption effect, which adds up to $16,000, which of course is a negative welfare effect. And now we have the revenue effect here, which is the domestic revenue effect, which is the collection of the duty, the tariff cost, plus the terms of trade effect. The terms of trade effect is that $200 that's being absorbed by the foreign exporter. So we have the $32,000, which is C, and then the $8,000, which is the terms of trade effect, gives you $40,000. Now, excuse me. Right, so the point here is just that the large nation has a lot more flexibility in the global marketplace to affect terms of trade. So in this case, the tariff was imposed, and the full cost of the full burden of the tariff does not fall upon the domestic consumers because the large nation is large enough that the exporting nation is going to absorb part of the tariff, which represents increasing national welfare. At the same time, though, there's a loss. Why is there a loss? Because there is still lower consumption, there's still an increase of inefficient domestic production, and there's still an increase of price. That represents a net loss or a net gain in national welfare, depending upon whether E is greater than B plus D, equal to B plus D, or less than B plus D. So if your terms of trade effect is greater than your protective and consumption effect, well, your national welfare is increased. If it's equal, the national welfare remains constant. And as you would naturally conclude, if it's less than, then your national welfare is diminished. As you remember, B plus D equals 16,000. This was 8,000, so 16 minus 8 means $8,000. In other words, your negative welfare effects, your deadweight welfare losses exceeded your terms of trade effect by $8,000. Any questions, thoughts, comments?
So is that is E dependent on the elasticity of the supply curve?
Is the terms of trade effect on the dependent upon the elasticity of the supply curve?
Yeah, so E would be greater if the supply curve is more elastic.
Well, not necessarily. It depends how elastic it is. I mean, here it's almost elastic. Yes, I mean, well, here's the demand curve. This curve is elastic. This curve is elastic. That's right. It's perfectly elastic. So my answer is it doesn't depend upon that. What
Okay.
depends upon is whether or not the nation is big enough to affect global prices. If the nation is big enough to affect global prices, if you're a big enough consumer, big enough customer, then the supplier is going to absorb some of the increase in costs, going to absorb some of the tax. Alec, yes, no, maybe?
Yeah, that works.
Okay, so what's the optimal strategy? The optimal strategy is to maximize the positive difference between your protective and consumption effect, your deadweight welfare losses, and your terms of trade effect, right? The problem with that is what? If I win, you lose. Any tariff that's imposed by a large nation, yes, there are going to be winners and losers. Who wins? Domestic producers. Who loses? Well, global trade loses. The exporting nation loses. They make less money, which means they have less money to buy the stuff that you want to then export. Yes? It's called beggar thy neighbor policy, because the optimal strategy for a large nation tariff is called the beggar thy neighbor policy, because I may be doing better, but it's at your expense. You know, I have less income to buy my goods and services, and global trade has been reorganized less efficiently as a result of these trade barriers. As you'll recall, we looked at the other day a list of tariffs around the world, average tariff rates, and the U.S. tariff rate is, what is it, under 2%? It's very, very low, and there's a reason for that. There's a reason why the charter of the WTO states that its objective is to eliminate all tariffs and non-tariff barriers among nations. The idea being that liberalized trade leads to a more efficient distribution of resources without the gating variables that trade barriers can impose, and all the negative welfare effects that come along with them. But are there any questions on this slide? So we say the large nation can impose its terms of trade by imposing the tariff, but in doing so reduces the trade volume and national welfare. We talked about the best strategy to maximize the positive difference between your deadweight welfare losses and your terms of trade effect. What I've done for you here is I put together a summary sheet that you can use to study for the exam. It shows you the small nation welfare effects, large nation welfare effects. Are there any comments on this or questions, thoughts? No? Okay. I'm going to move forward then. Let's take a look at there. So how does a tariff, an import tariff, affect a domestic exporter? What does this chart show us? We know that here's Caterpillar Inc. We know that if Caterpillar Inc. is facing higher steel costs as a result of steel tariffs on Canadian-made steel, well, they can either absorb it or they can pass through the costs to their consumers. If they pass through the cost to their consumers and their consumers resist higher prices, well, then they're going to be selling fewer tractors. So here we are, before the tariff was imposed, Caterpillar, we know, is going to maximize its profit where its marginal cost is going to equal its average cost. We see that here. Marginal cost equals average cost at $100,000 a unit. So what's going on? What's going on is that Caterpillar is going to produce 100,000 units, 100 units at $100,000 a unit, sold at $110,000 a unit for a profit of $1 million. As we see here, they face constant long run cost. Why? As a result of their economies of scale. So at every level of output, they're able to maintain their average costs, right? Their marginal costs will equal the average cost at every point in the long run. Okay, so what happens when there's a tariff imposed? Well, when the tariff is imposed, the cost of producing steel increases from 100,000 to 105,000, or to producing the tractor goes from 100 to 105,000. That's obviously going to have an effect not only on market demand but market supply. But in particular, the market supply is going to contract from 100 units to 90 units, and price goes up from 110 to 112,000 units, 112.5 a unit. So now the cost has increased 5%, the revenue has increased 2.2%, but you're only selling 90 units, so your profit is 675 versus $1 million, so you're down 32.5% on profit. Okay, so the tariff is there, but what do you have? You have lower sales, lower profits, and your export competitiveness has shrunk as a result of the tariffs. Remember, with tariffs, you have very concentrated benefits for very dispersed costs and tremendous downstream effects of tariffs. Think about what we just looked at with the economic data that came out today on the lumber costs. Lumber costs have been rising for years now since the Trump tariffs went into effect in 2018, have had a very negative effect, or having a negative effect on home prices, increasing home prices. And even though we see a relatively strong housing sector, we're getting some pushback from developers and from builders at a time when that's the last thing you want to see. Okay. Any questions here on this chart about Caterpillar?
Yeah, I have just a general question. So obviously what this chart is showing that tariffs on imports, well, the idea of their tariff is to help domestic producers. But what the chart shows us is it actually hurts the domestic producer. Is there any evidence in like any situation that a tariff on an import actually helped a domestic producer?
Well, I'm going to say, yes, there's lots of evidence that tariffs yes is the answer. Yes, there are instances where tariffs have hurt. I mean, there's absolutely no question that protectionist and interventionist policy has had its place in building the American machine, the American engine that it is today, and this phenomenal economy. It has had its role in building the American economy. The question that we have to wonder now, though, is what is the modern case for tariffs? And a strong argument can probably be made that in the infant industry argument, that in the nascent industry, the green revolution requires some type of tariff protection as it develops, and requires dynamic comparative advantage that can be affected by government policy. If you think about the government role in developing the internet, the government role in developing broadband, there have been some trade policies, industrial policies that have been put in place that definitely have affected those industries. In terms of what general trade theory says, general trade theory that embraces trade liberalization and free trade orthodoxy, is that anything that restricts trade, whether it's a non-tariff barrier or tariff, things like quotas and subsidies, that all those things are bad, that all of those things have a negative effect on the economy. So it's a long answer to a short question, but the simple answer is yes, there are examples where there are infant industries, nascent industries that have been helped. I'm thinking of the internet industry in particular, have been helped with some degree of tariffs that have the idea of a tariff. What makes a tariff useful is that it's for a very specific thing. It accomplishes a very specific thing. It's put on to amend some type of behavior, some type of unfair trade practice that is being practiced by your trade partner. It might be an unfair trade practice like unreasonable subsidies, and you may not be unable to achieve satisfaction with a World Trade Organization complaint brought, and are going to use some type of industrial policy in order to restrict or restrain that behavior, that there's a beginning point and an end point. To say that you need to put steel tariffs on because of national security, which is what President Trump argued back in 2018, that we need massive tariffs on Canadian steel. Canadian steel, our largest trading partner and our, key ally that we need, that it's a national security issue. And of course it wasn't. There was no, there was absolutely no rational strategy process. No rational strategy process for those steel tariffs, and there was no justification through economic theory for those steel tariffs. So again, I don't want to get too far off the point, but yes, there are examples where it's been helpful, mostly in infant industries. Whether or not there was a strong modern argument for a case for tariffs, modern case for tariffs, beyond that is one that I'd be hard pressed to find. So what is it that we know? We know that what is the result? That as a result of the tariff, Caterpillar is going to sell fewer tractors. It leads to the tariff has led to higher prices, reduced sales, and a less competitive export sector. We also know that rising prices are going to increase costs. And workers are then incentivized to demand higher wages, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but producers will face higher costs and higher production and wage costs. We know that tariffs cause imports to decrease, and they reduce export revenue of other nations, as we said before, and their ability to import US goods and services. Yes? So that falling exports lead to falling output, which leads to falling employment in exports industry, which leads to reduced trade volume and overall national welfare. It's a very straightforward analysis. If we buy less steel from Canada, that's become more and more expensive, well, that means Canada has less money to buy all the goods and services that we sell. If we do buy this steel, the steel that we do buy, of course, is more expensive than it was a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, by an enormous amount. Those costs are going to be shared. Ideally, I'm going to pass those through to my consumers, and if I can't, my profits are going to shrink. Well, I can either agree to lower profits, or I can try to find a way to cut costs elsewhere. So there are the downstream effects and all of the considerations that have to be made. Do I cut headcount? Do I cut personnel? Do I cut projects in the pipeline? Where do I cut because I'm making less money because my equipment is more expensive to the end user, the consumer, and they're buying fewer units than they were before as a result of those, as a result of that higher cost. So if we take a look at US tariffs, which is an interesting case on Chinese-made tires, we know that China entered the WTO in 2001. What they agreed to, as such a massive global exporter, was that members could suppress import surges coming from China without having to prove unfair trade practices. So let's see what happened. Between 2004 and 2008, shipments of Chinese-made tires, low-priced Chinese-made tires, increased the United States by 300%. We saw 4 US plants close and 4,500 production jobs were lost. Between 2009 and 2011, the Obama administration imposed new tariffs for 3 years that added to existing tariffs on low-priced Chinese-made tires. So you had the position of the Obama administration, which is they were just holding China responsible for what they said they would be responsible for, which was import surges into the United States. They also felt that tariffs would significantly reduce tire imports. It would boost US industry sales and overall profitability, and that the overall impact would be negligible on auto or truck production because tires represent a relatively small cost relative to the overall cost. So that was the position of the Obama administration. The position of US manufacturers, however, was different. They had long since abandoned the low-cost tire market, and they were no longer profitable to compete with. They're no longer profitable enough to compete with China, right? They were no longer competing with low-cost tire manufacturers from around the world, and any low-priced tires that were prevented from coming into the United States because of the tariffs were replaced by other low-priced tires from where? From Brazil, Indonesia, South Korea, because before the tire tariffs were imposed, the U.S. manufacturers had long since abandoned the low-cost tire market to overseas markets. So if you box out China, there are other nations that are willing to step in. Just the way if the U.S. stopped selling soybeans to China, China found its soybeans elsewhere. And all those soybean tariffs did was to hurt soybean farmers in the United States, right? China still has plenty of soybeans, right? The U.S. had an ample supply of low-cost tires, even though it boxed out China during this period of time. So what was the result of the tire tariffs? Well, the result of the tire tariffs was that tire manufacturing jobs, as you see, increased by 1,200. It's not to say that 1,200 jobs is not a great thing, but relative to what you spent and relative to what you were looking to accomplish, it seems like it's a bit of a failure, right? Because the tariff was credited with creating $48 million of additional worker income and purchasing power, but it forced consumers to spend an additional $1.1 billion on tires because of the tariff, which equates to about $900,000 per job per tire industry job created. So you see that there's an enormous disconnect. You have very concentrated benefits with very dispersed costs. Those jobs don't pay $900,000 a job. Why would you spend $900,000 a job to save those jobs when that industry has already been exported abroad years ago? It didn't make sense, right? Okay, so what did China do? Can anyone tell me? Do they know what China did as a result of those tariffs? What do you think they did?
Most likely retaliated. They probably put tariffs on our stuff.
They sure did. They put tariffs on our stuff. What stuff did they put their tariffs on? Do you have any family members or friends in the poultry business? Well, they killed the poultry business. They imposed tariffs ranging from 50 to 105% on American poultry. American poultry exports to China, which is a multi-billion-dollar, $4 or $5 billion a year industry, collapsed 90%. So, and did China have any problems selling its low-cost tires elsewhere? No, it found other markets, but it retaliated hard against the U.S. and created a lot of pain here among the poultry industry. So what's the conclusion? The conclusion is that tariffs on Chinese products make foreign firms much better able to compete in the U.S. markets. And when the U.S. imposes tariffs, it could expect retaliatory tariffs against its exports. Okay. Any questions here on this slide, folks?
Yeah, Professor, if you don't mind.
Sure, Brian.
How far do countries go in, I guess, not making a statement, but in retaliatory tariffs? Because, like, China's meat industry is, like, failing, right? With their diseases going around the animals and how much they import meat and all. So, like, wouldn't this hurt the China more than it hurt our country?
You're asking if the retaliatory tariffs that China imposed on U.S. poultry exports would hurt China because they were unable to source good quality meat then if they don't have the U.S. supplier. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, just how far do countries take these retaliatory tariffs? Because, in China's case, it's an interesting example given their whole meat industry and sector.
Right. Well, the fact is that in this case, I think you're talking about two different things. The condition of China's meat market, which partially compels it to seek meat products elsewhere, is not directly connected to their tariffs on American poultry products. If China isn't getting its poultry from the United States, it has ample other options to source poultry products. I'm thinking in particular from the European Union. And so therefore, much like it did with soybeans, they're a big consumer of soybeans. In fact, the largest consumer of soybeans in the world. And when they stopped buying American soybeans, they found other sources for their soybeans. In terms of how far nations will go as nations have shown themselves willing to go reasonably far when it comes to trade wars, which is why the famous comment made by President Trump that trade wars are easy to win, we know now as here in this class and as global managers that is absolutely not true. Global trade wars are not easy to win. Nobody wins. They're very destructive. How far are nations willing to go? Well, the U.S. has shown itself to go, in fact, very far under a recent president in terms of imposing tariffs, and has found itself confronted with retaliatory tariffs of equal size. So that's my answer, Brian.
Thank you, Professor.
Right, and as
Professor.
you see here, excuse me, that despite areas of wisdom we can identify within the Obama administration, we see here that in this case the wisdom was absent, because you spent a fortune trying to prop up an industry that had long since departed for an absurd amount of money. You would have been better off spending a fraction of that money training people, 1,200 people or more, to do other things in other industries. But to spend $900,000 per job for jobs that pay significantly less than that makes no, there's no economic rationale to it. So, okay. So now I'd like to talk about the supply and demand of protectionism. Yes, in other words, excuse me, when is it available? When do offers of protectionism, when are they made? What conditions have to be in place for offers of protectionism to be forthcoming from the government? What circumstances need to be in place for the demand of protectionism to increase or decrease? So we know that society pays a big cost for protectionism because there's lost consumer surplus and higher prices that leads to the deadweight losses of the protective and consumption effects. The supply of protectionism depends upon three things: the political importance of import competing producers. And I point out here, there's a difference between 10,000 auto workers, 580,000 textile workers, the 45,000 coal miners, or 20,000 copper workers that are working today. They have a different degree of influence, and that's understandable, of course. The supply of protectionism also depends upon whether there are large adjustment costs, whether there are tremendous legacy costs or long-term contracts that are very difficult to undo. So you look at a domestic industry like what? Like the steel industry that has faced tremendous contraction as a result of fierce import competition. And then finally, the supply of protectionism increases when there's public sympathy for a particular industry or worker group. As we've seen, for example, in certain cases with the coal industry or other areas of the domestic energy industry that is facing challenges from green energy sources around the world and facing contraction based upon what looks to be a coal-free future, a carbon-free future. So when we talk about the demand for protectionism, it depends upon a couple of things. Well, it depends upon the comparative disadvantage that an industry happens to have. If it worsens, they're going to demand more protection. So we talk about the steel industry here in the United States in the 1980s. Their demand also depends upon the level of penetration. So you see the level to which Japan was able to infiltrate the U.S. electronics market, dominate the U.S. electronics markets back starting in the 1960s. There was an example, getting back to, I'm trying to remember, it might have been Alex's question with regard to examples where the tariff policy had a positive effect. Early on in the U.S. electronics industry that needed support in order to fend off challenges from what was a more mature Japanese electronics industry back in the 60s and the 70s. And then, of course, U.S. electronics makers showed themselves able to innovate in a way that the Japanese stopped doing. And that, of course, led to the U.S. Developing a better, more strength within the electronics industry, and Japan's comparative advantages becoming less significant as time went on. We've discussed that before, the change in comparative advantage. over time. Obviously, the greater the concentration of domestic production, you're going to see, for example, the U.S. auto industry is going to have a lot more influence than a smaller industry, and then the degree of export dependence. So if you fear retaliatory tariffs, so the U.S. aerospace industry, for example, Boeing, which has a lot of overseas markets, would fear retaliatory tariffs against U.S. made airplanes if the U.S. was engaged in some type of trade war, the ongoing trade war that was under the last administration. Of course, there was concern about whether or not there would be tariffs placed upon or other type of tariff barriers placed upon the U.S. aerospace industry, which is an enormous sector here in the United States. Any questions here on the supplier demand and protectionism? Very straightforward stuff. Okay, so we talk about different arguments for and against trade restrictions. Well, we know that there's protection against cheap foreign labor, which is that the U.S. companies demand protection because they say that I'm competing with companies that pay their workers 5 cents an hour. How do I possibly compete against that? The problem with that, though, is that it doesn't recognize the links between imports and exports and the links between efficiency and production and wages. So just because the country has very low wages doesn't mean that the country is necessarily very efficient. So low wages don't necessarily equal low costs, right? So we point out here, the low wages of developing nations are going to be offset by higher labor productivity in the United States, as this chart shows. So here we see labor productivity relative to the US, which is a fraction of the US. Wages to the US are a fraction of the United States. And unit labor cost, you see that the US is more competitive than all of the nations here and is less competitive than the nations here, that low wages don't guarantee low production costs. That's the point. So we have low wages in other countries that's offset by higher productivity in the United States. Okay. So talk about the argument that because of cheap labor, we need protection. And these are the reasons why we're saying that it's not necessary because of the fact that low wages don't necessarily guarantee low costs. And then the next argument is that the trade restrictions make sure that there's fairness in the global trading market, that there's a level playing field, right? That restrictions are needed to offset unfair competitive advantages because foreign producers are not subject to the same thing that, for example, U.S. producers are subject to. Regulations about pollution control, labor rights, workplace safety. That's a common argument. Well, the problem is it doesn't recognize what? It doesn't recognize that as a result of those regulations that you have cleaner water, cleaner air, and safe workers. It also doesn't recognize that as a result of those trade restrictions, what are we going to see? Lower trade volume, falling production and employment, and declining national welfare. And any tariffs on imports is going to have a result on the export sector. Why? Because, as we've said, the downstream effects of tariffs. So you impose tariffs on incoming steel and lumber, there's going to be effect on your export sector for products that are exported that use lumber and steel. Next, we talk about the free trade argument. And since the beginning of the semester, we've talked about the idea of specialization, exchange, and trading by comparative advantage. We identified David Ricardo, who in the early 1800s talks about trade based on comparative advantage. Nations should specialize in what they're good at and exchange for the rest. The idea that lower prices are achieved in the long run through higher levels of productivity, output, income, and consumption. Critically, the theory says that changes in comparative advantage, whether it's changes in technology, productivity, wages, or demand, plus free market forces are going to compel adjustments to take place, and that companies are forced to fine-tune their operating strategies, just like you as students are compelled to fine-tune your operating strategies, whether it's to succeed in a class or succeed on an interview, or you understand, right? But the free trade argument holds that tariffs and non-tariff barriers do what? They prevent natural market adjustments, and they result in economic stagnation and a loss of economic activity for the nation. And finally, we look at the argument about job protection, that those that say we need to put in place tariffs to protect jobs. Well, look what was the example we saw with the footwear tariffs. Well, you imposed tariffs, and the result was you created some jobs. Some jobs were created not very much at an astronomical cost, right? So you end up costing domestic consumers infinitely more than each one of those jobs that were created or protected, right? So what we see is the dual nature of international trade, where your changes to your nation's imports are closely related to the change in exports. So as we've said many times, using the steel industry as an example, that domestic industries that face higher steel costs, imported steel costs, are going to pass those on to their consumers. Okay, so again, there's the free trade argument, job protection, protection against cheap foreign labor, and the free trade argument. Are there any questions about these four interesting ideas? Right, it's very common to say, well, we shouldn't have regulation in the United States because they don't have regulation they have to contend with in China with regard to labor, the environment, workplace safety. Well, yes, those add layers of cost, but there's a price to pay for the way that you live and the manner in which you're able to conduct business in a free society. Are there any thoughts, observations, comments, questions
Professor?
before we talk about the midterm?
Yeah, Professor?
Hmm?
Has the government ever considered, instead of raising tariffs to protect a certain job section or sector, and instead of doing that, why not just use funds from the government to create training programs to transition to different jobs
Well, you're exactly
that we should be
right.
doing?
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, that's a foundational argument. In other words, what's missing from the mix? What's missing from our social safety net? Exactly that. Those types of programs, those types of initiatives that make that happen on a regular basis. One industry is being disintermediated, being automated. Well, we're going to take the people in that industry, we're going to train them for a new industry. That's when I talked about Germany and their apprenticeships programs. It doesn't leave anybody behind. So yes, that's why classes like this are important, discussions like this are important, and young leaders like yourselves are important, because it's you who will take these ideas and hopefully breathe life into them as you mature in your careers. But that's exactly right. That's what we're missing, Michael. We're missing that type of initiative in our job market. That's right. So let's talk about the midterm. The midterm is going to be somewhere between 50 and 60 questions. It'll be timed. You'll get well, we're going to meet on Monday for some last minute notes and a review or some comments I'm going to make. We're also going to, on Monday, for class, chapter 4, number 16, everybody do that problem. It's a mapping problem on welfare effects. It will help you on the exam, and I'm going to go over it in detail on Monday in class, and we'll do some
Wait,
final
Professor.
things. Chapter 4, number 16.
Chapter 4, number 16.
Right.
Got it.
Not Monday's class is going to be an abbreviated class. I know that everybody's, well, I'm not going to get to that yet. Monday's class will be an abbreviated class, in fact. But like I said, chapter 4, number 16, please do it. I'm assigning to you chapter 4 homework. You have all the information now after our last 2 sessions to do the homework. I'll post answers to it on Monday before class. And on Monday in class, we'll talk about the procedure for Wednesday's exam. Excuse me. As I said, it's going to be a mix of true, false, and multiple choice. I can't tell you the split. I haven't written the exam yet, but the exam will be eminently fair. We'll cover the topics since the beginning of the semester, including the capital markets and everything we've done since then on chapters 1, 2, 3, 4. This is a list of everything we've covered so far. And if I was you when I'm studying, my presumption is that all of you have done the homework and read the text the way you've been assigned. And now all you should really need to do is go through and make sure you're comfortable with these topics. You have all the slideshows. You have the homework assignments that you've done. You shouldn't have to reread the chapters. But like I said, this is a list of all the key things that we've talked about, from, well, capital markets and the Fed, globalization, static dynamic change, trade documents. I'm not going to go through all of them, but it's everything that we've done, okay, all the way down to trade effects, small versus large nation model, to hedging, accounts payable, accounts receivable with a money market hedge, forward hedge, call options, okay? If you eyeball this for a moment, look at if there are any questions, tell me if you have questions. In terms of the mapping problems, I'm going to give you 2 problems on the midterm that are going to ask you to map welfare effects for small and large nation. That's what I'm going to be testing you on in terms of mapping, okay? So that's why I focused on that here. You want to make sure that you really have that down pat for the exam, that you really have that, okay? There's nothing on this list that we haven't covered thoroughly in class.
Can you repeat the math question again? What did you say was going
The
to be?
mapping, in other words, when we map the welfare effects, those are mapping problems. So I will ask you 2 problems, I think. I haven't, like I said, I'm working on the exam over the weekend, but I think I'll ask you 2 problems for mapping. You want to make sure that you understand the mapping of the welfare effects for small nation and large nation. This is chapter 4, okay? You want to make sure that you understand the theory that we've gone over about the evolution of modern trade theory from mercantilism all the way through Keynes and Stefan Linder and overlapping theory of overlapping demand in the 1960s. This is a list of all the formulas that we've gone over since the beginning of the semester, beginning with the openness index, the marginal propensity to consume, the expenditure multiplier, foreign exchange quotes, balance of payments, GDP, WACC, the marginal rate to transformation, commodity terms of trade, the forward hedge, money market hedging, the wage ratio, labor ratio, and the effective rate of production. Okay. Now, I'm giving this material to you to review. In a class setting, I never have an open book exam. And when I give you the exam to take, you're going to sign it and say that you're agreeing that you're not taking the exam with any help. You're taking the exam with a pen or paper and a notebook and a calculator. I can't be there with you to make sure that you do that, but that's what I'm going to say, and that's what the exam is going to state in its opening, the rules for the exam. This is meant to help you review, to focus on the things that you need to know. Again, this is a list of all the formulas that we've worked with over the course of this part of the semester. You have this, you have this list, you have these formulas, and then you have this, which you have already a copy of, which is a list of all of the theory that we've gone over since the beginning of the discussion of theory, beginning with chapter 2. Okay, and that's all. Are there any questions you have for me?
Yes. Is it going to be through Blackboard or a PDF file?
Oh, sure.
exactly
That's a
work?
good question. It's going to be Blackboard. I'm going to send you a link on Wednesday morning, Wednesday evening at 7:30. You're going to be able to log on to the link, and you'll have 90 minutes to take the exam. And it's all very straightforward. It's very organized. I think you know by now I am organized. You will get everything that you need. Again, Monday will be a chance for a review, to review this problem, chapter 4, number 16, do some last minute things that I want to clean up with you on Monday before the exam. And like I said, Wednesday, you'll get everything from me in terms of the link and any last minute instructions Wednesday morning, and we'll be good to go Wednesday night. Okay?
Yes, thank you.
Sure, Sahar, no problem. Anybody else? Questions, thoughts?
For the maths question, are there going to be multiple choice as well?
Of course. In other words, yes, they're going to be multiple choice.
Professor, how many questions in total?
1,000. No, not 1,000. I think it's going to be somewhere between 50 and 60. I will include extra credit questions.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
I will include extra credit questions, and I remain available to all of you between now and, of course, next week. Again, we still have another class on Monday, so I remain available to you. You all have been sending me questions. I've been responding to them. Continue to do so. And thank you for keeping an eye on the Fed's meeting today. I appreciate that. And beyond that, I'm going to wish everybody a good continuation of your evening, a safe evening, and I want to wish you all a great good luck on your midterms. Okay, I'll see you on Monday. Yeah.
Professor, I have a question.
Mhm.
So when you give the exam, it's all going to be on one page?
No, it's going to be going to give you the exam, and then you're going to log in. Have you taken Blackboard exams yet?
Yeah, but there's two types. There's like one question one by one where you can't go back.
No. I don't do that. No. No, you'll get the exam. You'll get the exam all at once, and then you take the exam.
Okay.
I'm not
thank you.
I'm not a fan of tricks or anything like that. I give a very straightforward exam. I don't like trick questions. You know what you're supposed to study. I've given you very clear parameters of what you should look at, and are made fully available to all of you between now and then. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank
Good night, everybody. Thank you very much.
Have a good night, Professor.
Have a good evening, everybody. Thank you.
Professor,
Thank
Yep.
you, Professor. Good night.
I just wanted to know, how would you suggest we study? Because there's a lot of information here. There's the book, there's your slides and lectures.
Well, as I just was saying, I think that at this point, you should have, at this point, okay, you have read the chapter, you have done, my assumption is that you've done the reading and you've done the chapter work, the homeworks in the book. And therefore, you should not have to read the book.
Right.
What you have are the slides from me, and I've just given you a very comprehensive list. List is everything we've done since the beginning of the semester, the capital markets, all the way through trade effects on small and large nations, and some hedging here at the end. But this is everything we've done, and so this is what the exam will cover, these various things. So, for example, here, effective versus nominal tariff rates. We reviewed that tonight. It's a very tight list. We talked about that we've gone over very specific things since the beginning of the semester, first with capital markets, then moving on to globalization, trade theory, and comparative advantage, and now onto tariffs. And so this is your review list. Work from this, look at the slideshows.
Do you have any practice exam we can look at?
I don't have any practice exam for you to look at. What I have is, you have your homeworks, you have the hedging homeworks that I provided for you, you have the capital markets review work that I provided for you, and you have all the slideshows, and plus you have this list. You know, some of these things on this list, for example, effective versus nominal tariff rates is relatively small. When you talk about the evolution of modern economic theory, that's a much lengthier bit of material. And there are things here that are, everything here is what is fair game for the exam. So the answer to your question is no, there are not practice exams, but the exam will be fair, and you have a very specific idea of what it's going to cover and how to go about studying. And these slides are meant to help you in that effort.
And nothing on current events, right?
No, nothing on current events, not a thing.
Have a good night.
Have a good night, Professor.
Thank you so much. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Thank you so much.
Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.